A Silhouette in a Dream. Teo Nialamos, Celine Russo. Yoratiz, Celine Russo. Rivers, rivers, rivers of blood. The smell of warm copper and salt. The gentle swirl of her thoughts as her focus escaped her, as she began slowly drowning in her own mind. This was the way the dream always started. Tes souple poumon baissés, n'est-ce pas? You've been begging for me, haven't you? His harsh whisper beside her ear. The feeling of his clammy hand against her skin. His palm slicked with sweat. The sickening twist of her stomach. He'd been the younger brother of one of the atelier's best clients. A wealthy wastrel used to having whatever and whomever he wanted. Accustomed to spending his father's money as though he alone had earned every franc. He'd stared at Celine for the last 3 months, a greedy light in his gaze. It had unnerved her then, but she'd known better than to anger him by drawing attention to it. Weeks later, she still recalled how his hands did not seem like the hands of a gentleman, for they were calloused and worn. In truth, nothing about him, despite his breeding and his wealth, indicated he was a gentleman. His hands were roughened by horseback riding. Indeed, he was one of the finest riders in his elite circle of friends. With these hands, he'd offered to soothe her, offered to bring her something warm to drink, asked if he could keep her company. Celine had not known what to do when he'd come to the door of the atelier long after dusk. His fine cloak about his shoulders and his breath reeking of wine. She'd asked him to return home, but he'd been insistent, barreling into the workshop as though he owned it. In her dream, Celine observed the scene from above, as though the conscious part of her had separated from her body in sleep. She witnessed the events unfold with punishing slowness, watched herself make mistake after mistake as though God himself wished to teach her a lesson. A dull thud sounded in her ears. Her striped chambray dress tore from her shoulder when the young man tried to stop her from fleeing. Everything after that was a haze. Celine counted herself lucky that he'd barely managed to take hold of her skirts before her fingers had flailed about, scrabbling for anything with which to defend herself. The candelabra had not been a choice. It had been the best weapon she could grasp. Celine often wondered, in moments to herself, if she'd meant to kill him. Surely she could have struck him using less force. Surely she did not have to aim for the side of his head. Surely she could have prevented his death. But no. In the darkest of her dreams, she'd known the truth. In Celine, evil had found the perfect vessel. She'd meant to destroy the young man, as surely as he'd meant to destroy her. While she'd watched the blood seep from his body, she'd searched her soul for a drop of regret, a hint of remorse. She'd found none. She'd clutched the candelabra tighter, prepared the lie to tell her father, knowing she could not stay where she was. Once more a muted thud vibrated in her skull. Who would believe Celine had been the victim? After all, she was not the one lying cold and motionless on the atelier floor. The dream version of herself stared at the growing circle of crimson, stepped back so it would not stain the hem of her skirts. And then, something new and curious began to take shape in the blood pooling about her feet. Usually, Celine was barefoot in his memory, her toes sliding across the cold marble, trying to avoid any contact with the boy she'd killed. Tonight, a symbol formed beside her toes. The same symbol she'd seen earlier, smeared in the wood next to Annabelle's body. Something soft brushed across the tip of Celine's nose. She looked up. A flutter of golden yellow petals cascaded around her, settling into the widening pool of blood, turning into hundreds of embroidered handkerchiefs the instant they touched the marble floor. Then, the lunar goddess dragged her chariot across Celine's dream. The thudding in her ears grew louder, more insistent. Everything dissolved in a sea of black. Celine woke with a start. Though her room was dark, all was not still. The thuds were sharper now, no longer muffled, a clatter of wood against stone. She flinched as a cool mist dampened her skin. The shutters outside her window had blown open. A storm raged beyond them, sending sheets of rain sideways, driving water into her tiny room until everything it touched felt alive. Celine stood, almost slipped, as her bare feet slid across the wet stone floor. She took the few short steps to the window of her cell, then sighed. Merde! She cursed to no one. It couldn't be helped. If she was to secure the latch once more, she would have to lean forward and be drenched. Celine considered wrapping herself in a shawl. It would be appropriate to do so. Her night shift was fashioned of thin cotton. If rain soaked through the garment, it would be inappropriate for her to stand beside the window and risk being seen. Her expression hardened when she realized her shawl was nowhere within reach. The wind continued beating at her shutters, the rain gusting through her room. Propriety be damned. Celine battled a particularly harsh gale, then reached over the windowsill to grasp the wooden latch. Signs of motion caught her eye. She froze. Though the rain continued bearing down on her, soaking through her hair, seeping through to her skin, Celine blinked back the drops. It looked as though a figure hovered in her periphery. Positioned beside a pillar near the gate of the convent's wrought iron fence. She blinked again. The silhouette vanished. Celine's heart crashed through her chest, the blood thinning in her veins. She yanked the shutters closed, latching them together in a seamless motion. Then she reached for a length of thick cotton. The blood continued pounding in her body as she stripped off her night shift and pulled a clean chemise from her meager chest of clothing. One thing was certain, something had shifted tonight. Ever since that evening in the atelier nearly 6 weeks ago, when evil had taken refuge in her bones, Celine had felt torn. Certainly between right and wrong, but more than that, between who she was and who she thought she should be. Celine Rousseau was a girl who believed in justice. That young man had meant to rape her, to destroy her body and soul. Was it wrong for her to destroy him instead? She knew the right answer, the one the Bible taught, because Celine was also a girl raised on the 10 Commandments, and it was wrong to kill. But were there ever times it could be right? Could Celine Rousseau be a girl who valued life, as well as a girl who had taken it from someone, without a shred of remorse? It was like walking the edge of a cliff. If Celine fell to one side, she would be good evermore. If she fell to the other, she would be consumed by evil and lose all chance of redemption. Celine knew it sounded silly, but to her it felt true. It wasn't possible for good and evil to reside in the same person, was it? Celine blinked hard into the damp darkness. After the events of this evening, She shouldn't be concerning herself with such things. She should be trembling in her nightdress, poisoned by a different kind of worry. Tomorrow, despite her best efforts, Celine's world could crumble like a castle made of sand. In the afternoon, Detective Grimaldi would come to the convent to finish questioning them. It had been his favor to the Mother Superior, a woman well acquainted with his family. Celine had watched in quiet shock as the elderly matron had advocated for her and for Pippa, begged the young detective's forbearance. "Miss Russo and Miss Montrose are fine, upstanding young women," she said. "They will be more than happy to cooperate. Of course, they will answer any questions you pose to them. But please grant them this night to mourn the loss of their friend, to reflect on the actions that brought about this unfortunate turn of events." Celine had looked away when she heard those words, her shame a dagger through her heart. Not a trace of guilt could be found on the Mother Superior's face, but the wizened woman had spared Celine, offered her a pardon on the steps of the gallows. Tomorrow, Michael Grimaldi would renew his inquiries. What if the detective looked into Celine's past with his eerie, colorless eyes? What if he'd asked why she journeyed across the Atlantic? What if he learned she was a murderess? It could be her undoing. Celine's hands shook as she wrapped the length of thick cotton around her hair, trying in vain to wring the waist-length strands dry. Her dreams taunted her. Her memories failed her. Her desires had become reapers in the dark. She struggled to marshal her emotions. If she did not take control of her life, of these fears, they would be sure to control her. She could not allow this to happen. Succumbing to fear was the surest way to lose her footing. Celine made her way back to her narrow rope bed, determined to fight for a measure of peace, so that she could prepare for what tomorrow might bring. When she reached for the coarse linen sheets at the foot of her mattress, she froze in her tracks. The golden petals, the embroidered handkerchiefs. She blinked once, twice. The length of thick cotton wrapped around her hair unraveled to the stone floor at her feet. Her body trembled. Bastian had tucked away a folded piece of fabric in his trouser pocket. In the warm glow of the gas lanterns, it had looked like a buttery silk handkerchief. In the bright light of day, it would be yellow, like the ribbon missing from Annabel's hair.